strong arranger. He does a lot of big band writing, and he just had a piece played by the Philadelphia Orchestra. He does a lot of stuff in Europe too. You probably see him at some point, and he's in Germany a lot. He just did a record with the WDR band, and his specialty is actually Afro-Cuban music and clave. So he sort of came through the mambo big band tradition of like Mario Bauza and some of those other people. For a long time, he wrote for the Lincoln Center Orchestra and for the Lincoln Center Latin band, whatever that's called, Afro-Cuban, whatever. So anyway, so that's his thing. And then Antonio Hart is the other guy. He's a great alto player who is playing with Dave Holland now, and he sort of came up with Roy Hargrove. So he's sort of, if that gives you an idea of what he plays like, he's part of that. He was part of that Young Lions sort of movement in the 80s, I guess, and 90s. But he's a guy his values are that it's really important to connect to the tradition in some way. And he would say, even more than me, what I wanted to talk to this Polish guitar player about was, what function does the interpretation of melody have in what you do? Not to mention swing feel. There was like 8 bars of swing in the whole concert, which is fine. Again, I don't really have an answer to this question. It's just that for me, and I guess the thing that made me want to talk about it at this master class, maybe we'll have a master discussion. So you're all masters. Anybody who takes the microphone becomes the master.
Mm-hmm.
And okay. All right. So the thing that brought all this up for me is, you have a situation, and I think it's true also here, although maybe a little bit less so. I mean, there's a lot of people that come for a wide bunch of reasons to jazz schools. But I think it's interesting to me, there's a situation where all of the professors are more part of this tradition than the whole student body. Now, there's places where that's not always true. I mean, there are always students, there's a new student coming, for example, to Queens next year who sounds a lot like Oscar Peterson. So, but he's definitely coming out of the tradition. What Antonio would say is, what's the connection to blues and jazz? And I wouldn't necessarily put it quite like that, but I think that's an interesting question to ask yourself. In my own personal side of this, I mean, you guys are all in a school called, New York Comes to Groningen, so you know this is like, that's the New York, right? I mean, that's the part. So, now, I tend to be fairly open-minded about what students do, and that's, like, I'm not passing judgment on it. Even when I said that thing to Anna Hus, I was just saying, do you want to have this as part of your music or not? What I've noticed is, the question I had for this Polish guitar player was, when you go out and hear music that's sort of on that level of complexity, with that little amount of improvisation and melodic interpretation, and basically forms that are all about the soloist is kind of jumping through hoops in order to make the forms work, because the forms are so incredibly confining that it's very hard to get free on it. Do you like listening to that kind of music? And he said, everybody in this ensemble had a different reaction. And some people said, no, I find this music incredibly boring, but it's really fun to play. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. That's how I used to feel about free music. I love playing free music, but I found sometimes going to free music concerts a little boring. But it was really fun to play. And I think that's a completely valid reaction. It's like, I love to play this. I'm not really sure how I feel about listening to it. That's okay. You're musicians. You got into musicians because you like to play, not necessarily because you like to listen. So that's also why people become students. Certainly not because they like to listen. So, but you're stuck here until at least before. Then you can listen. But anyway, so I just think it's interesting to think about what connection, like, why do you play music? Why do you play this music? Now, when I asked the guys, the Russian guitar or the Polish guitar player that, I said, well, why do you play jazz instead of, what you're writing? Because basically it was like a fusion band in the sense that every note was written out. It was really complicated. There was a lot of intricate stuff that was happening. And then they soloed on it, and the solos were all like of so much secondary importance to everything that happened. Basically, it was about these complex forms and this complex writing that happened in front of it. And and he said, well, he said 2 things. One is, the reason why he does this instead, because I said, really, you could just write everything out. And that's a question, you sort of want to ask yourself, would it be just as good if I wrote everything out? And what he said was that jazz for him, or what he does, is mostly about you could write everything out, but you wouldn't get to the level of rhythmic complexity that you do when people are improvising together. Like if you listen to classical music, even though there's a lot of rhythmic complexity, it's not the same kind. It's not this constant reinterpretation of odd meter. So actually the reason why he got into jazz was because classical music, he didn't feel like had a complex enough rhythmic structure. Which is an interesting reason. You know, your music is going to sound a certain way if that's what you think. So okay, that was interesting, you know. And then of course, and then when we started talking about more, he said the music he actually grew up playing, and that he really still comes out of in a way, is heavy metal. And I was like, oh, okay, well if you think of, you know, Meshuggah, I don't know if you guys know that record or that band, you know, it's like that. It's incredibly complex. You know, it's like actually there are no rock people in the audience anymore. Now it's all jazz guys at the Meshuggah concerts, you know, so it's kind of come full circle. You know, it's so rhythmically complex that rock guys don't like it anymore. So it's like, oh, okay. So, but it still sounds like that with the vocals like, you know, whatever, I don't know. So anyways, that's where he's coming from. The other thing that I want to talk about, Anyway, sorry. It's so unusual, right? It's so unusual. I have something to say. So okay, so this is my one question: is like, why are you playing music? You know, and I guess, and I actually at some point actually gonna. So think about that, because I really do. I'm gonna take some answers to that question from you guys. But first, before I do that, I'm going to talk about something else along the same lines. First of all, there's a lot of different reasons I think you could have for wanting to play this music. And I think it all has to do with what the improvisation is about. And when I think about Coltrane playing like these 30-minute, you know, one-chord tunes, for me, if I think about that music is kind of like about, you know, like when you take you have like you're washing your socks because you didn't bring enough. You're on the road somewhere in a hotel. I know this experience all of you guys have had. You're on the road in a hotel. You didn't bring enough socks and underwear, so you're washing it in the sink, and then you're hanging it over the shower rod. Just think back to those experiences. Okay, so when you take the socks and you want to get the water out of it, you're doing this. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's called ringing, W-R-I-N-G in English, wringing out the stuff. I feel like when I hear Coltrane, that's what he's doing with his like soul, basically. He's like taking it and sort of getting every ounce of emotion sort of out of his playing. That playing is about almost like a kind of catharsis. I don't know if that's a word everybody knows, but it's about like just letting out incredible amounts of energy and psychic pain or whatever. It's about this kind of incredible release, and that's what that music sounds like to me. And then take Tommy Flanagan. Tommy Flanagan doesn't so much sound like that particular thing. To me, Tommy Flanagan is like listening to somebody who's really a very together person, who has a lot to say in a kind of beautiful manner. He's like sort of taking you through an argument, or telling, you know, to use this often used metaphor, it's like he's telling you a story. He's a great storyteller. So for Tommy Flanagan, for me, like with him, it's sort of like, how does he manage to put his sentence right? Have such it's almost like they used to call him the jazz poet, and it's like reading a poem. It's like reading a very like straightforward poem that kind of connects things in a way that seems obvious, but you never thought of it. That's kind of what Tommy Flanagan feels like to me. Now, I think a lot of times in school, we talk about rhythm, about having a good time feel, about saying something, or no, we don't, we never talk about saying anything. We talk about like having a good time feel and playing chords well, mostly, you know, and then we say transcribe stuff and imitate things and then make up stuff on your own and do that. The one thing we don't really talk about too much is what's your solo about? Why are you telling us? Why are you soloing at all? Wouldn't it be better if it was just written out? And I think that's a really important question to ask yourself. When I was sort of trying to figure out what I was going to do, first I was going to be a writer, and then I'm like a fiction writer, and I did that for a couple of years, and the stories were horrible, and so I quit. Thank goodness. In fact, I think I said this here once before. I found some of those old stories and I read them and I couldn't even play the piano for a week. It was like anybody who can write a story this bad has no creative ability.